position! Engage the enemy!
While the world watched the grand clash between the Allies and the Axis powers during World War II, a brutal and complex conflict unfolded within the borders of Yugoslavia that defied the simple narratives of the global war. This wasn't just a story of resistance against Nazi occupation. Instead, Yugoslavia became the stage for a vicious three-way civil war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left scars that would haunt the Balkans for generations. When Germany invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, the country shattered like glass. But from the fragments emerged three distinct fighting forces, each with radically different visions for Yugoslavia's future. The communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito fought to create a socialist federation. The royalist Chetniks sought to restore the Serbian monarchy, and the fascist Ustaše collaborated with the Axis powers while pursuing their dream of an independent Croatian state. These three factions would spend the next 4 years fighting not just the occupiers, but each other, in a conflict so tangled that former allies became mortal enemies and the line between resistance and collaboration became impossibly blurred. Yugoslavia in 1941 was a nation held together by little more than hope and diplomatic treaties. Created in the aftermath of World War I, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had always been an uncomfortable marriage of South Slavic peoples. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnian Muslims, Macedonians and Montenegrins had been pressed together under a Serbian-dominated monarchy, but ethnic tensions simmered constantly beneath the surface. The kingdom's strategic position made it impossible to ignore as war engulfed Europe. Wedged between Italy, Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Greece, Yugoslavia was surrounded by Axis powers or their allies. Prince Paul, ruling as regent, tried desperately to maintain neutrality, but Hitler had other plans. When a military coup on March 27, 1941, overthrew the regent who had just signed a pact with Germany, Hitler flew into a rage. He ordered the immediate invasion of Yugoslavia. Determined to punish the Yugoslavs for their defiance, Operation 25 began on April 6, 1941, with German bombers reducing Belgrade to rubble in a terror raid that killed thousands of civilians. The Yugoslav Royal Army, poorly equipped and hampered by ethnic divisions within its own ranks, crumbled within days. German forces pushed south while Italian troops invaded from the west. Hungary, Bulgaria, and even Albania joined the feeding frenzy, each seizing pieces of Yugoslav territory. By April 17, just 11 days after the invasion began, Yugoslavia had ceased to exist as an independent state. The Axis powers carved up Yugoslavia like a birthday cake. Germany annexed northern Slovenia and occupied Serbia directly. Italy took southern Slovenia, coastal Dalmatia and Montenegro. Hungary grabbed territories in the north while Bulgaria occupied Macedonia. But the most significant creation was the independent state of Croatia, a puppet regime that would become the stage for some of the war's most horrific atrocities. The independent state of Croatia, proclaimed on April 10, 1941, was led by the Ustaše, a fascist organization that had spent years in exile plotting its rise to power. The man who would lead this new state was Ante Pavelić, a lawyer turned revolutionary who had cultivated relationships with Mussolini's Italy and harbored genocidal ambitions toward Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The Ustaše ideology was a toxic blend of extreme Croatian nationalism, Roman Catholic religious zealotry, and racial pseudoscience. They viewed Croats as a superior race corrupted by the presence of Orthodox Serbs, whom they considered subhuman. When handed control of a state that included over 2 million Serbs within its borders, the Ustaše saw not a problem of governance but an opportunity for elimination. Within weeks of taking power, the Ustaše launched a campaign of terror that shocked even their German patrons. They established concentration camps, the most notorious being Jasenovac, where tens of thousands of Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents would be murdered with medieval brutality. Unlike the industrial killing operations of the Germans, the Ustaše often murdered with knives, hammers and axes, making their genocide intensely personal and savage. The Ustaše pursued a policy they called clerical fascism, attempting to forcibly convert Orthodox Serbs to Catholicism while murdering those who refused. Entire villages were massacred, their inhabitants thrown into rivers or burned alive in their churches. The scale and brutality of Ustaše atrocities would eventually drive tens of thousands of Serbs to join resistance movements, not just to fight occupation, but to survive. The Chetnik movement emerged from the wreckage of the Royal Yugoslav Army. Its leader, Colonel Dragoljub Dragoljub Mihailović, had refused to surrender after Yugoslavia's collapse. Instead, he retreated to the Ravna Gora mountain in western Serbia and began organizing a resistance movement loyal to the exiled Yugoslav king and government in London. Mihailović envisioned the Chetniks as a traditional guerrilla force that would preserve Serbian military capability until the Allies arrived to liberate Yugoslavia. He was a cautious, methodical officer who believed in avoiding reckless confrontations with the Germans that would only bring reprisals against Serbian civilians. This conservative approach would ultimately prove to be his movement's undoing. The Chetniks drew their support primarily from Serbian populations, especially in rural areas. They saw themselves as defenders of Serbian interests and the traditional Orthodox Serbian monarchy. Many Chetniks were motivated by genuine patriotism and anti-fascism, but the movement's ethnic character and its focus on Serbian restoration alienated other Yugoslav peoples, particularly Croats and Bosnian Muslims, as German occupation policy relied heavily on collective punishment, with 100 Yugoslav hostages executed for every German soldier killed. Mihailović became increasingly reluctant to engage in active resistance. Instead, he focused on preparing for a general uprising that would coincide with an Allied invasion. This waiting strategy created a dangerous vacuum that his communist rivals would eagerly fill. Most controversially, local Chetnik commanders began making tactical accommodations with Italian occupation forces and even German units to focus their efforts on fighting Tito's communist partisans. What began as pragmatic local agreements gradually evolved into something closer to collaboration. Some Chetnik units effectively became auxiliaries of the occupation forces, receiving weapons and supplies in exchange for fighting the communists. Josip Broz, who would become famous under his nom de guerre Tito, represented everything the old Yugoslav establishment feared. A Croatian metalworker who had fought with the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, Tito returned to Yugoslavia as a committed communist organizer. He had survived Stalin's purges of Yugoslav communists by demonstrating absolute loyalty to Moscow, and by 1941 he had become the leader of the Yugoslav Communist Party. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 25, 1941, everything changed for the Yugoslav communists. Stalin's orders were clear: all communist parties in occupied Europe must begin immediate armed resistance to tie down German forces. Unlike Mihailović, who counseled patience, Tito embraced immediate action. On July 4, 1941, the Partisans launched their first attack against German occupation forces. The Partisans' strategy differed fundamentally from the Chetniks in several crucial ways. First, they were aggressive from the start, launching attacks that drew brutal German reprisals but also proved that resistance was possible. Second, and most importantly, they consciously organized on a multi-ethnic basis, recruiting Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, and others into a unified movement that promised equality in a future socialist Yugoslavia. Tito understood that in Yugoslavia's fractured society, ethnic inclusivity wasn't just morally correct but strategically essential. While the Chetniks became increasingly identified as a Serbian movement and the Ustase were exclusively Croatian, the Partisans offered a vision that transcended ethnic divisions. Their slogan, "Brotherhood and Unity," resonated with Yugoslavs who were horrified by the ethnic violence consuming their country. The communist organization gave the Partisans other advantages. They established a command structure that was disciplined and effective. They created mobile hospitals, printing presses, and even schools in liberated territories. They organized women into combat and support roles. Most importantly, they implemented ruthless discipline, executing deserters, looters, and those who committed ethnic violence, which helped maintain cohesion and moral authority. By late 1941, Yugoslavia had descended into a nightmarish conflict where everyone was fighting everyone. The Germans and Italians occupied key cities and lines of communication. The Ustase controlled Croatia nominally, but faced armed resistance in Serbian-populated regions. The Chetniks and Partisans both fought the Axis forces but increasingly fought each other. The first major confrontation between Partisans and Chetniks came in western Serbia in the autumn of 1941. Initially, the two movements had attempted cooperation, with Mihailović and Tito meeting several times to coordinate actions, but their fundamental differences proved irreconcilable. The Partisans' aggressive tactics brought savage German reprisals that killed thousands of Serbian civilians. Mihailović believed the communists were sacrificing Serbian lives for their revolutionary agenda, while Tito saw the Chetniks' caution as defeatism and collaboration. The breaking point came when the two groups competed for control of the town of Ustase. By November 1941, they were fighting each other as bitterly as they fought the Germans. The communists established a short-lived Republic of Ustase, a liberated zone where they implemented socialist policies and organized a defense industry. But a massive German offensive crushed this first partisan republic and forced Tito's forces to flee eastward in the harsh winter of 1941–42. Meanwhile, in Croatia and Bosnia, an even more vicious cycle of violence had begun. Ustaše atrocities against Serbs drove survivors to join either Chetnik or partisan bands. These resistance forces would then attack Ustaše units or Croatian villages, triggering new rounds of Ustaše reprisals. The German and Italian occupiers would launch their own pacification operations, burning villages and executing suspected partisans. Each massacre bred new fighters for the resistance. Each resistance attack brought new massacres. The ethnic dimension of the conflict created impossible moral complexities. Serbian Chetniks, traumatized by Ustaše genocide, sometimes committed atrocities against Croatian and Muslim civilians, viewing entire communities as collectively guilty. Croatian peasants, caught between partisan demands for support and Ustaše terror, often had no safe choices. Bosnian Muslims formed their own militias for self-defense, sometimes collaborating with the Italians or Germans, sometimes joining the partisans. The winter of 1941–42 nearly destroyed Tito's partisans. Driven from Serbia by combined German and Chetnik forces, the communists led some 20,000 fighters and refugees in a desperate march through the mountains of Bosnia, trying to reach safer territory. They were pursued relentlessly, harassed by Chetnik bands, attacked by Ustaše units, and bombed by German and Italian aircraft. This period tested the partisans to their absolute limits. They marched through deep snow in inadequate clothing, with limited food and ammunition. The wounded had to be carried on improvised stretchers. Thousands died from cold, starvation, disease, and enemy action. Yet the march also forged the partisan movement into a more formidable force. Those who survived became hardened veterans with unshakable commitment to the cause. By spring 1942, the partisans had established themselves in Bosnia, where the complex ethnic geography offered both challenges and opportunities. Bosnia's mixed population of Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslims created a complicated political landscape. The Ustaše had alienated all non-Croats with their violence, creating potential recruits for the resistance. The partisans worked to position themselves as defenders of all ethnic groups against fascist terror, while Chetnik bands pursued an increasingly Serbian nationalist agenda that repelled Croats and Muslims. The Battle of Neretva in early 1943 represented a crucial turning point. German, Italian Ustaše, and Chetnik forces attempted to encircle and destroy the main partisan force, which was burdened with thousands of wounded being transported in a mobile hospital. In a brilliant piece of military deception, Tito ordered his engineers to blow up a bridge over the Neretva River, convincing the Axis forces that the partisans would retreat westward. Instead, the partisans secretly rebuilt the bridge and crossed eastward, breaking through the encirclement and reaching the relative safety of eastern Bosnia. As the war ground on, the lines between resistance and collaboration became increasingly blurred, creating situations that would haunt Yugoslavia for decades. Mihailović, still recognized by the exiled government and the British as the leader of Yugoslav resistance, found his authority undermined by local Chetnik commanders who made ever deeper accommodations with the occupiers. In Montenegro, Italian occupation forces essentially subcontracted security operations to Chetnik units, providing them with weapons, food, and money to fight the partisans. In Serbia, some Chetnik bands collaborated with the German puppet government of Milan Nedić, joining anti-communist operations while nominally maintaining their identity as resistance fighters. Mihailović himself never ordered full collaboration, but he lost control over significant portions of his movement. The moral calculations that led to collaboration were complex. Some Chetniks genuinely believed that preserving Serbian lives was more important than fighting a hopeless battle against overwhelming German force. They reasoned that the Allies would eventually win the war, and when they arrived, the Chetniks would rise up. In the meantime, fighting the communists seemed to serve both the immediate goal of survival and the long-term goal of preventing a communist takeover. But these calculations ignored crucial realities. The longer Chetnik units received Axis weapons and fought alongside occupation forces, the more they appeared to be collaborators rather than resistance fighters. Reports reaching London told of Chetnik massacres of Muslim and Croatian civilians, of Chetnik units wearing Italian uniforms, and of coordinated Chetnik, German operations against the partisans. The image of Mihailović as a heroic resistance leader was being destroyed by the actions of forces he could no longer control. The partisans exploited these developments brilliantly in their propaganda. They portrayed the Chetniks as traitors, servants of the enemy, and Serbian chauvinists. They documented Chetnik collaboration and disseminated it to Allied intelligence services. They emphasized their own multi-ethnic composition and their consistent record of fighting the Axis. Gradually, they convinced the British that they, not the Chetniks, represented the real resistance in Yugoslavia. The Allied policy toward Yugoslavia was initially straightforward: support Mihailović, and the Chetniks as the legitimate resistance movement recognized by the exiled government. Britain sent military missions to Mihailović's headquarters and even promoted him to general. But as reports of Chetnik collaboration accumulated, and as the partisans demonstrated their effectiveness, British policy began to shift. Winston Churchill, despite his fierce anti-communism, was a pragmatist who cared primarily about who was killing the most Germans. By 1943, British intelligence officers attached to both the Chetniks and partisans were sending back reports that painted a devastating picture of Chetnik inaction and collaboration, while praising partisan effectiveness and organization. The most influential of these reports came from Brigadier Fitzroy MacLean, who parachuted into partisan-controlled territory in September 1943. MacLean was shocked by what he found. The partisans controlled large swaths of territory, operating hospitals, schools, and even light industry in areas they had liberated. They fielded disciplined units that fought with determination and skill. They had built an entire administrative structure that functioned as an alternative government. Perhaps most importantly, they were tying down significant Axis forces that might otherwise be deployed against the Allies elsewhere. In November 1943, Tito convened the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia in Jadz, declaring it the provisional government of Yugoslavia and stripping the king of his authority. This was a bold political move that infuriated the exiled government, but it demonstrated the partisans' confidence and organizational sophistication. Britain and the United States faced a choice: continue supporting a resistance movement that was increasingly collaborating with the enemy, or shift support to the communists who were actually fighting. Churchill made the fateful decision at the Tehran Conference in late 1943. He informed Stalin and Roosevelt that Britain would shift its primary support to Tito's partisans. Supplies, weapons, and military advisors would flow to the communists, while support for Mihailović would be reduced and eventually cut off entirely. This decision effectively determined Yugoslavia's post-war fate, as it ensured that the partisans would emerge from the war as the dominant military and political force. By 1944, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Soviet armies were advancing toward Yugoslavia from the east, Italy had surrendered and switched sides, and Germany was clearly losing the war. The three-way civil war entered its bloodiest phase as all sides realized the conflict's end would determine Yugoslavia's future. The partisans, now receiving substantial Allied support, grew in strength and sophistication. They fielded entire divisions equipped with Allied weapons and supplies. They operated artillery, used radio communications effectively, and coordinated complex operations across multiple fronts. Their numbers swelled as Yugoslavs who had sat on the fence now joined what was clearly going to be the winning side. The Chetniks, isolated and increasingly desperate, made a final bid for relevance. Mihailović attempted to reorganize his forces and demonstrate their commitment to fighting the Germans, but it was too late. Many Chetnik units had become so deeply entangled with the occupiers that they had no choice but to continue fighting the partisans, now serving effectively as Axis auxiliaries. Even as Germany's defeat became inevitable, the Ustase faced their own reckoning. As partisan and Soviet forces approached from multiple directions, the independent state of Croatia began to disintegrate. Ustase leaders, knowing they faced certain execution if captured, attempted to flee westward with their most loyal troops, hoping to surrender to the British rather than the partisans. Croatian civilians, fearing partisan revenge for Ustase atrocities, fled alongside them in a massive refugee column. The final liberation of Yugoslavia came from multiple directions simultaneously. Soviet forces entered from the east, liberating Belgrade in October 1944 with partisan support. The partisans themselves pushed westward from Bosnia, northward from Dalmatia, and southward from Slovenia. By May 1945, as Germany collapsed, partisan forces controlled virtually all of Yugoslavia. The end of World War II did not bring peace to Yugoslavia. Instead, it brought a final, savage settling of accounts. The partisans, victorious and vengeful, hunted down those they considered collaborators and war criminals. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Yugoslav history, though one that would be suppressed and hidden for decades. Tens of thousands of Ustase soldiers, Croatian civilians, and Chetnik fighters who had surrendered to British forces were forcibly repatriated to Yugoslavia. Despite knowing what awaited them, British military authorities handed over these prisoners to the Partisans in what became known as the Bleiburg repatriations. The Partisans marched these prisoners in death columns away from the border, executing thousands along the way and working many others to death in forced labor camps. Mihailović himself went into hiding as the Partisans hunted him relentlessly. He was finally captured in March 1946, tried for treason and collaboration, and executed by firing squad in July 1946. His trial was a show trial in the Soviet style, designed to justify the communist victory and eliminate any possibility of royalist restoration. The evidence of his collaboration was mixed with fabrications, but the outcome was never in doubt. The death toll from Yugoslavia's three-way civil war is impossible to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest that of the roughly 1 million Yugoslav citizens who died during World War II, at least half were killed by other Yugoslavs rather than by the Axis occupiers. Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims all suffered horrific losses. The Ustase genocide claimed hundreds of thousands of Serbian, Jewish, and Roma lives. Partisan and Chetnik reprisals killed thousands more. Entire regions were depopulated by violence, forced displacement, and famine. The three-way civil war that consumed Yugoslavia during World War II defies simple narratives of resistance and collaboration. It was a conflict where victims became perpetrators, where resistance fighters committed atrocities, and where the complexities of ethnic hatred, ideological conflict, and occupation combined to create a whirlwind of violence that devastated the South Slavic lands. Tito emerged victorious not just because he was ruthless or because he received Allied support, but because he offered a vision that transcended ethnic divisions. His promise of brotherhood and unity in a socialist federation appealed to Yugoslavs who were exhausted by ethnic violence and who hoped that communist internationalism might succeed where royalist unity had failed. For 45 years, Tito's Yugoslavia would suppress the ethnic tensions that had erupted so violently during the war, maintaining an uneasy peace through a combination of economic development, political repression, and the marshal's personal authority. But the wounds left by the three-way civil war never truly healed. The memories of atrocities, the unresolved questions about collaboration and resistance, and the ethnic hatreds that had been inflamed during those terrible years lay dormant beneath the surface of Tito's Yugoslavia. When the country began to fracture in the late 1980s, these old demons would return with a vengeance, producing new horrors that echoed the violence of 1941 to 1945. The Yugoslav experience during World War II reminds us that wars of occupation inevitably spawn civil wars, especially in multi-ethnic societies. It demonstrates how quickly neighbor can turn against neighbor when state authority collapses and ethnic entrepreneurs exploit fear and hatred. It shows how resistance movements can themselves become sources of terror, and how the moral clarity of fighting fascism can be lost in the murky realities of civil war. Perhaps most importantly, Yugoslavia's three-way civil war illustrates the lasting consequences of violence and the difficulty of achieving genuine reconciliation. The mass graves, the burned villages, and the murdered families of 1941 to 1945 cast shadows that stretched across generations, ultimately contributing to Yugoslavia's violent dissolution 50 years later. In the Balkans as elsewhere, the past is never really past, and the wounds of civil war resist all efforts at healing.